The invisible door people walk through. Most people assume that emotional disturbance comes from what others say or do. A criticism, an insult, a dismissive comment, or even a subtle tone in someone's voice seems to carry the power to disrupt the mind. But when you observe human behavior carefully, something more subtle begins to appear. The disturbance rarely begins with the words themselves. It begins in the silent moment where the mind decides what those words mean. This is the invisible door most people never notice. Someone speaks. A sentence enters your awareness. For a brief moment, it is simply sound, language, information. But then the mind moves quickly. It interprets the words, attaches meaning to them, compares them with your identity, your pride, your expectations. Within seconds, a quiet interpretation forms beneath conscious awareness. And from that interpretation, emotion emerges. By the time anger, irritation, or frustration appears, the process has already happened. The door has already been opened. What is rarely understood is that this opening is not forced from the outside. It is granted from the inside. Words cannot directly reach your emotional state without passing through interpretation first. They require cooperation from the mind. This is why two people can hear the same comment and respond completely differently. One person reacts immediately, feeling insulted or challenged. Another hears the same words and remains calm, almost curious. The difference is not in the situation. It is in the interpretation that quietly formed in the mind before emotion appeared. Once you begin to see this mechanism, something important becomes clear. Emotional disturbance is not simply a reaction to events. It is the result of meaning that the mind assigns to those events. Most people never observe this step. They move directly from stimulus to reaction, believing the emotion was inevitable. But the disciplined observer starts to slow this process down. Instead of being carried immediately into reaction, the mind begins to watch itself. It begins to notice the moment interpretation forms. A comment is made. The mind prepares to react, but now there is a pause. A brief space appears between hearing and reacting. In that space, awareness begins to operate. Instead of accepting the interpretation automatically, the mind begins to question it. Was the comment truly meant as an insult? Was the tone intentional, or simply careless? Does the situation actually require emotional involvement at all? In many cases, the answer becomes surprisingly simple. The situation was never powerful enough to deserve the emotional reaction that followed. But because the interpretation happened so quickly, the reaction felt justified. As awareness grows, the invisible door becomes easier to recognize. The mind begins to see when emotional permission is about to be granted. And once you see the door clearly, you begin to understand that it does not have to open every time someone speaks. Words may still arrive, situations may still occur, but the internal decision to react becomes more deliberate. Instead of reacting automatically, the mind becomes selective about what it allows inside. Gradually, a shift occurs in how the world affects you. Situations that once felt personal begin to appear more neutral. Comments that once triggered irritation begin to feel less important. The emotional atmosphere of the mind becomes less dependent on what others say or do. Not because the world changed, but because the mind stopped granting automatic access to every voice that happened to reach it. The quiet rule of psychological distance. Most people believe that emotional control means suppressing reactions or pretending not to care. But suppression is fragile. When emotions are merely pushed down, they remain close to the surface, waiting for the next moment of pressure to rise again. True emotional composure comes from something much quieter and far more powerful: psychological distance. This distance is rarely visible, yet it changes the entire dynamic of human interaction. In everyday life, people constantly exchange subtle signals. Tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, and even silence communicate meaning beneath the words being spoken. These signals form the invisible layer of social dynamics, where influence often takes place. When someone criticizes you, challenges you, or attempts to provoke a reaction, they are not only communicating information, they are also testing where your emotional boundaries exist. Most individuals respond instinctively. A defensive tone appears. An explanation begins. Irritation surfaces. In that moment, the reaction becomes information. It quietly reveals that the words have found a place inside your emotional space. And once this happens, the other person has learned something important. They now know where influence can reach you. Psychological distance interrupts this process. When the mind creates space between the external event and the internal response, the situation changes immediately. Words are still heard, behavior is still observed. But the emotional connection that normally forms between the event and the reaction does not activate in the same way. Instead of reacting instantly, the disciplined mind observes. Observation is not passive. It is a form of control. It allows the mind to process information without becoming absorbed by it. When someone speaks in a provocative tone, the observer notices the tone rather than being carried by it. When criticism appears, the observer examines the content rather than defending against it. This shift may seem subtle, but its psychological effect is significant. When reactions disappear, the feedback loop that normally fuels social tension begins to weaken. Many provocations rely on immediate emotional responses. A person expects irritation, disagreement, or visible frustration. These reactions confirm that the provocation succeeded. They create momentum in the interaction. But when the reaction does not appear, something unusual happens. The dynamic changes. The emotional energy that normally drives the exchange loses its direction. Without visible reaction, the attempt to provoke becomes uncertain. This does not require confrontation or resistance. It requires distance. Distance allows the mind to see behavior without becoming entangled in it. A person raising their voice becomes simply a person raising their voice. A criticism becomes simply a statement that may or may not contain useful information. An insult becomes noise unless the mind decides it deserves meaning. Through this process, emotional boundaries become stronger. Not through force, but through clarity. Instead of reacting automatically, the mind begins choosing when a situation deserves emotional investment. Over time, this calm distance produces a subtle but powerful shift in how others interact with you. People often sense when emotional reactions are difficult to provoke. Conversations become more measured. Attempts at manipulation lose effectiveness because they no longer produce predictable responses. The disciplined individual does not become emotionally cold or indifferent. Instead, they become selective. Attention and emotion are directed intentionally rather than automatically. In this way, psychological distance quietly transforms the balance of influence in social situations. What once felt like pressure from the outside becomes simply information observed from the inside, and the person who maintains this distance begins to operate from a position where external voices no longer determine the internal atmosphere of the mind. The discipline of silent observation. Most emotional reactions feel automatic. A comment is made, a tone is perceived, and the mind immediately moves toward defense. Words begin forming internally before awareness even has time to examine the situation. The impulse to respond appears so quickly that it feels natural, even necessary. Many people interpret this impulse as strength, the ability to defend themselves instantly. But when you examine this pattern carefully, you begin to see something else. The speed of reaction is often the very thing that weakens control. Immediate reactions rarely come from clarity. They come from emotional momentum. When the mind reacts too quickly, it is responding to the first interpretation it creates about the situation. That interpretation may be incomplete, exaggerated, or shaped by past experiences rather than the present moment. But because the reaction appears instantly, it feels justified. The mind convinces itself that the response was necessary. This is where silent observation begins to change the process. Silent observation introduces a pause between the external event and the internal response. It does not require withdrawal or suppression. It simply requires awareness to remain present long enough to watch the reaction forming instead of immediately acting on it. In that brief moment, something interesting happens. The emotional impulse that felt urgent begins to lose some of its intensity. What seemed like a personal attack begins to look like a situation that may not require emotional involvement at all. The mind starts to recognize the difference between what happened and what it initially assumed had happened. This pause interrupts the automatic cycle between stimulus and reaction. Most people live inside that cycle without realizing it. Something occurs, the mind interprets it quickly, and emotion follows. Once emotion appears, behavior follows emotion. Words are spoken, tones change, tension increases. The entire interaction unfolds from a reaction that may have been unnecessary from the beginning. Silent observation prevents this chain from forming so easily. Instead of allowing the first emotional impulse to dictate behavior, the mind remains still long enough to examine it. The impulse is noticed, the irritation is seen, the urge to respond is acknowledged, but none of these signals are immediately obeyed. This does not mean the emotion disappears. Emotions still arise, but they are experienced differently when they are observed instead of acted upon instantly. When the mind watches its own reactions forming, it begins to recognize how temporary they are. What feels intense in the first seconds often fades when attention remains calm. Through repeated practice, this awareness begins to reshape how the mind experiences conflict. Situations that once felt like emotional threats become easier to analyze. Instead of reacting to tone, posture, or implication, the mind starts focusing on the actual content of what is happening. Many provocations lose their power under this kind of observation. Their effect depends on the speed of reaction. Without that speed, the emotional momentum never fully develops. The individual practicing silent observation gradually becomes more difficult to disturb because their reactions are no longer automatic. Emotional impulses may still appear, but they are not allowed to immediately direct behavior. The mind learns to wait, to watch, and to understand before responding. Over time, this quiet discipline creates a different internal environment. Emotional responses become slower, more deliberate, and far less influenced by external behavior. Situations that once produced tension begin to feel manageable. The mind no longer feels pushed by every stimulus that appears. Instead, awareness becomes the space where reactions are examined before they are expressed, allowing the individual to move through difficult interactions with a calm that is not forced, but consciously maintained. The quiet power of untouchable composure. Imagine a version of yourself who hears criticism, provocation, or judgment without feeling the immediate need to defend or react. For most people, this idea feels unrealistic at first, because the mind has been conditioned to treat emotional disturbance as something unavoidable. A harsh tone triggers irritation. A dismissive remark creates tension. A moment of disrespect begins to echo in the mind long after the situation has passed. It feels as if external behavior has direct access to the internal atmosphere of your thoughts. But this belief quietly dissolves once a different understanding begins to develop. Emotional disturbance does not come from the presence of criticism or conflict. It comes from the mind's attachment to the meaning it assigns to those events. When someone speaks in a provocative way, the mind often interprets the moment as a challenge to identity, status, or respect. Once that interpretation forms, the emotional system reacts automatically to defend what it believes is under threat. Yet this entire process depends on one assumption, that every external signal deserves emotional participation. The individual who becomes difficult to disturb begins questioning this assumption. Instead of accepting every emotional impulse as something that must be acted upon, awareness begins to step in quietly. A comment is heard, but instead of reacting immediately, the mind observes the situation more neutrally. What once felt like a direct attack begins to appear as information about another person's behavior, mood, or intention. This subtle shift changes the relationship between the mind and the outside world. When emotional attachment to every interaction fades, many situations lose their psychological weight. Words still exist, but they no longer feel like commands that demand emotional energy. Criticism still appears, but it becomes something that can be evaluated, rather than something that must be resisted. Even confrontation begins to feel less threatening, because the mind no longer treats every disagreement as a personal challenge. Through this process, composure becomes less about effort and more about clarity. The mind begins to see how often emotional disturbance originates from unnecessary internal involvement. Situations that once seemed significant begin to look temporary and limited in importance. Instead of being pulled into every emotional exchange, the individual starts choosing where attention and energy should be placed. This does not create emotional indifference. It creates emotional selectivity. Attention becomes a resource that is used intentionally, rather than automatically. Some situations deserve careful engagement, thoughtful discussion, or even strong response. But many others do not require emotional investment at all. They pass through awareness without leaving a lasting mark. Over time, this quiet discipline produces a noticeable change in how others interact with you. People often sense when their attempts to provoke reactions are no longer effective. Without visible emotional signals to respond to, confrontational dynamics lose momentum. Conversations become calmer. Conflicts resolve more quickly. Attempts to influence your emotional state gradually become less frequent. What once felt like pressure from the outside begins to feel more like observation from the inside. This is the quiet form of power that develops when emotional stability becomes consistent. The mind no longer depends on the behavior of others to determine its internal condition. Situations can still be intense, unpredictable, or uncomfortable, but they no longer control the emotional direction of your thoughts. And in that moment, A realization begins to settle quietly into awareness. When the mind stops granting automatic emotional access to every external voice, the world may still speak loudly, but its ability to disturb your internal balance begins to disappear until the strongest position in any interaction becomes the one where your composure remains entirely your own.